The first enemy Jacob Barnes faced in Iraq did not carry a weapon. It was the environment itself, a relentless adversary that waged a war of attrition against his senses. The heat was the field commander, a physical and oppressive presence that greeted him the moment the C-17's ramp lowered. This was not the humid, sticky heat of Louisiana. It was a dry, searing heat that seemed to radiate from the ground and the sky itself, a furnace blast that stole the moisture from his lungs and made the horizon tremble. The dust was its infantry, a powder-fine, tan-colored dust that infiltrated everything with a malignant persistence. It was in his food, his water, the grease of his rifle. He could feel it grinding between his teeth, in his eyes, at the back of his throat, a constant reminder that he was in an alien place that was actively trying to invade him. And there was the sound, the constant artillery of the base, the deafening roar of fighter jets taking off on night missions, the pulsating thud of Black Hawk helicopters, and the maddening, omnipresent hum of diesel generators that were the ceaseless heartbeat of that city of metal and concrete. For the first few days, he moved in a state of sensory overload, his brain struggling to process the torrent of new stimuli. The world was a blur of beige tones, white noise, and a heat that never relented. It was a form of low-level torture designed to wear down his resistance and remind him of his insignificance in the face of the desert's vastness and the magnitude of the war machine. The human ecosystem of Al-Assad Air Base was as strange and dangerous as the physical environment. It was a place of transitions, a purgatory where the arriving souls passed the departing ones, and the interaction between the two groups was a study in contrast. Jake and the other newcomers, the FNGs, fucking new guys, were painfully obvious. Their uniforms were too new, their faces too pale, their movements still rigid with the formality of training. They walked in groups, a nervous pack of rookies trying to find safety in numbers, and then there were the veterans, the men they were replacing. They were a different breed. Their uniforms were faded by the sun until they were almost white, their skin tanned like old leather. They moved with a tired economy of motion, an efficiency born not of discipline but of exhaustion. And their eyes were the most frightening thing. They were empty, unfocused. The 1,000-yard stare he had read about, a gaze that didn't see what was in front of it, but what was forever behind it. They didn't look happy to be going home. They just looked hollow, used up. A few of them glanced at Jake and the other new arrivals, and on their faces was a mixture of pity and contempt. An older sergeant with a face like a wrinkled road map spit on the ground near Jake's boots as he passed. "Fresh meat," he muttered. The words hit Jake with the force of a punch. In those men, in those tired, dirty ghosts, he saw himself in a year. He saw the price of survival. He saw what the war did to a man's soul. The image of those empty eyes would haunt him, a premonition of what he would have to become to one day board that same plane home. The base itself was a monster of concrete, metal, and razor wire, a fortified city that stretched for miles in the middle of nowhere. For Jacob Barnes, who grew up amidst the open fields of Ohio, it was a claustrophobic labyrinth. The streets were narrow corridors, flanked by 12-foot-high T-shaped concrete barriers, known as Bremer walls, designed to absorb the impact of mortars and rockets. Walking through these corridors was like being at the bottom of a canyon, with only a slice of pale blue sky visible above. It created a feeling of being both protected and imprisoned at the same time. The living quarters were CHUs, containerized housing units, metal boxes that baked under the sun during the day and became refrigerators in the cold of the desert night. Life was a containerized existence, from the bunk to the office to the chow hall. The only variation in the beige landscape was the tangle of razor wire that crowned every wall and surrounded the entire perimeter of the base, a constant reminder that although they might be in a bubble of American order, they were on an island surrounded by an ocean of chaos. The vastness of the base was overwhelming, but it was a vastness without a horizon. Everywhere Jake looked, his view was blocked by another concrete wall, another fence, another row of containers. He realized that the geography of the base was a metaphor for his new life, a narrow, predefined path with little freedom of movement, designed for the sole purpose of keeping him alive, but at the same time keeping him trapped. After days of manual labor and acclimatization, the mental preparation began. Jake and his platoon were herded into a makeshift briefing room, a plywood box, with a loudly rattling air conditioner. The lights were dimmed, and a projector lit up a screen at the front. An intelligence officer, a captain with dark circles under his eyes and a monotonous voice, began the briefing. It was in this moment that the abstract enemy, the nameless force they had trained against, began to acquire a face. The captain showed slides with grainy photos, taken from drones or by informants. They were portraits of ordinary-looking men, some young, some middle-aged, identified as local insurgent cell leaders. He showed maps of the region, with red splotches indicating areas of high IED activity. He described their tactics, the use of car bombs, complex ambushes, the way they blended in with the civilian population. For Jake, it was a profoundly unsettling experience. It was one thing to train against cardboard targets. It was another thing entirely to see the face of a man who would be actively trying to kill him in the coming week. The war ceased to be a concept and became a portrait gallery. He studied the faces on the screen, searching for some sign of evil, some clue to their nature, but he found nothing. They just looked like men, and that normality was the most terrifying thing of all. The enemy was not a monster. He was human, and Jacob Barnes's job would be to hunt and kill these men. The doctrine was taught by Sergeant First Class Carver, who seemed perfectly at home in this hostile environment. His lessons were not from the field, manuals. They were from the University of Survival. In one session, he drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard. On one side, a drawing of uniformed soldiers in formation. On the other, a scatter plot of dots. "In your grandfather's war," Carver said, his soft voice filling the room. "You fought this." He pointed to the soldiers in formation. "An army. They wore uniforms. There was a front line. It was complicated, but it was simple. We," he circled the scatter plot of dots, "fight this. An insurgency. An idea. There is no front line. The battlefield is everywhere. The enemy doesn't wear a uniform. He's the man who sells you bread in the morning and plants a bomb in the road in the afternoon." He turned to face them, his pale blue eyes sweeping the room. "Because of that, your most important weapon is not your rifle. It is your mind. It is your ability to understand the local culture, to know when to smile and when to shoot, to win the trust of the people while searching for the enemy among them. It is the hardest war to fight because it doesn't just happen out there. It happens in here." He tapped his own temple. "It will force you to question everything you think you know about right and wrong. My job isn't to give you the answers. It's to keep you alive long enough for you to start asking the right questions." Jacob Barnes felt the depth of the lesson. He was being prepared not just for a physical conflict, but for a moral and existential puzzle. The firing range at Al-Assad was a surreal place. It was an isolated stretch of desert, surrounded by sand berms where the air shimmered with heat, creating mirages that made the distant targets dance and contort. The purpose of the day was to zero their rifles, a process of adjusting the sights for the unique atmospheric conditions of Iraq. As Jake lay in the hot sand, which seeped into every fold of his uniform, he felt a seismic shift in his perception. The last time he did this was in Louisiana, an exercise in proficiency. Here it was an act of preparation for killing. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of the desert dust. The sharp crack of the rifle shots echoed in the vast silence, an unholy sound in that ancient land. He focused on his breathing just as Carver had taught him, finding the point of stillness between the beats of his heart. He squeezed the trigger, the recoil a familiar, violent force against his shoulder. He watched through his scope as a small puff of dust erupted on the distant target. He adjusted his sights, repeated the process again and again, until his shots were consistently hitting the center. Every shot was a declaration of intent. Every hole in the paper target was a rehearsal for a hole in a human body. The skill he had discovered in himself, the calm under the pressure of controlled violence, now felt less like a talent and more like a curse. He looked over at Diaz and Tex beside him, their faces caked in sweat and dust, their eyes narrowed in concentration. They were no longer boys learning a trade. They were craftsmen, calibrating their tools for the bloody work that awaited them. A significant portion of their preparation was dedicated to their primary mode of transport and their primary source of danger, the Humvee. They learned that the vehicle, which looked so imposing and indestructible, was in fact a notoriously vulnerable metal coffin when it came to IEDs. Carver had them study every inch of the Humvee, learning its weak spots, the places where bombs were most effective. They spent hours practicing dismount drills, bailing out of the vehicle under simulated fire. It was a chaotic and violent choreography involving jumping out, finding cover, and establishing a perimeter of security, all in a matter of seconds. Being inside the Humvee on a simulated patrol was an exercise in claustrophobia. Jake would sit in the back, squeezed between Diaz and a mountain of gear, peering out through a small, thick pane of bulletproof glass that distorted the world into a warped and threatening landscape. The sound of the diesel engine was deafening, communication within the vehicle done through headsets. He felt as though he were in the belly of a steel beast, blind to the outside world except for his small slice of vision. He learned that the greatest enemy in a Humvee was complacency. The temptation was to relax, to trust the armor, to let your vigilance wane. But as Carver constantly reminded them, the armor only worked until the moment it didn't. The Humvee was not a sanctuary, it was a target. The most terrifying lesson was on IEDs. In a darkened briefing room, Carver projected a series of photos onto the screen that were seared into Jake's memory. They were not technical diagrams, they were the aftermath. Military vehicles torn apart like tin cans, craters in the road, and the gruesome censored remains of what were once human beings. "This," Carver said, his voice devoid of emotion, "is your #1 enemy. It is not a soldier. It does not wear a uniform. It waits silently under the earth for you to make a mistake." He then showed them how to spot the signs. They learned the paranoid art of observation. They learned to look for disturbed earth, for a nearly invisible tripwire glinting in the sun, for a piece of trash, a plastic bag, a cardboard box that seemed out of place. They learned to be suspicious of animal carcasses on the side of the road, a common hiding place for explosives. The lesson transformed the outside world into a universal minefield. Every inanimate object became a potential source of threat. Paranoia, they learned, was a survival tool. After that lesson, Jake never looked at a road the same way again. He found himself scanning the ground in front of him, even inside the base. Carver was rewriting his neural software, installing a program of fear and vigilance that he knew he would never be able to uninstall. He was teaching them the language of the invisible enemy. The ultimate consequence of failure was taught through a medevac drill that was so realistic it bordered on sadistic. During a simulated patrol, a bomb went off, and one of Jake's team members, Evans, was designated as the casualty. But it wasn't just a verbal designation. A team of combat medics took him and, in minutes, applied combat wound moulage. When they brought him back, his leg looked as if it had been amputated at the knee, complete with fake blood and protruding bone fragments. Evans's scream was horrifically convincing. Jake's brain knew it was a simulation, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The sight was so grotesque that for a moment he froze. Carver's voice crackled in his headset. "He's bleeding out, Barnes. What do you do?" The training took over. He and Diaz dragged Evans to cover while Tex provided suppressing fire. Jake applied a tourniquet high on Evans's thigh, wrenching it tight until the bleeding stopped. He then grabbed the radio, and, his voice trembling, recited the 9-line medevac request, a rigid format for requesting a helicopter. "Line 1, location. Line 2, radio frequency." Carver would interrupt, screaming that he was too slow, that his brother was dying. It was the most stressful experience of his life. Afterward, Carver gathered them. "The golden hour," he said. "That's how long you have to get a critical wound to a surgeon. You did that in 12 minutes. In the real world, that can be the difference. Between life and death." Jake looked at Evans, who was now wiping the fake blood off his leg, and felt the truth of the lesson in his gut. In the quiet of their metal container, long after lights out, the facade of bravado that the soldiers wore during the day began to crack. The dark gave them permission for vulnerability. It was on one of these nights, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and gun oil, that the true bond between Jake's fire team solidified. It wasn't in a drill of fire and movement, but in a whispered conversation. Diaz, who during the day was a source of jokes and energy, was the one who started it. "I keep thinking about that IED class," he said into the darkness, his voice stripped of its usual swagger. "How the hell are you supposed to spot a wire in the middle of all that trash?" Tex from his bunk answered with his farmer's calm. "You can't see everything. You just do your best. Trust the guy in front of you to do the same." The silence settled for a moment. Then Jake spoke, the question that was haunting all of them. "Are you guys scared?" The question hung in the hot air. It was Diaz who answered first, his voice low. "I'm terrified." Tex added, "Any man who says he isn't is either a liar or a fool." Jake felt a knot in his chest loosen. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing, of freezing, of making a mistake that would cost one of these men their lives. "I just don't want to let you guys down," he admitted into the darkness. And in those whispers, they discovered the universal truth of the soldier, that the greatest fear is not of one's own death, but of the responsibility for the lives of one's brothers. They were not supermen. They were just scared kids. And in that shared admission of fear, they found a strength that no physical training could ever give them. One of the most difficult tasks for Jacob Barnes was writing letters home. It was a mission of disinformation, a campaign to construct a fictional reality for his parents, to shield them from the truth of his existence. He would sit on his bunk, the small reading light illuminating the page, and struggle to find the words. He couldn't write about the fear, about the IED class, about the vacant faces of the returning veterans. So he wrote about the weather. "It's hot here," he would write, an understatement so massive it was almost comical. He wrote about the food. "The food in the chow hall isn't as bad as they say," he would lie, omitting the fact that everything tasted of dust and fatigue. He wrote about his comrades. "I've made some good friends," he would write, simplifying the complex web of dependency and loyalty into a postcard-ready sentence. Every phrase was a careful construction designed to reassure. He was building a bridge across the chasm between his world and theirs, but it was a bridge made of paper and white lies. The act of writing these letters filled him with a profound loneliness. By censoring his own reality, he was isolating himself even further. He was creating a version of himself for his family's consumption, a soldier Jake who was brave, positive, and safe. But the real Jacob Barnes, the one who was scared, exhausted, and being slowly remade by the war, remained a secret, a stranger to the people who loved him most in the world. On the night before their first patrol outside the wire, Sergeant Carver conducted a final inspection. It was not like the humiliating inspections of basic training, where the goal was to find fault. This was different. It was solemn, almost a religious ritual. The platoon stood in formation inside the barracks, each man with his full combat gear laid out in front of him in a precise pattern. Carver moved down the line, not shouting, but speaking in a low voice to each man. He wasn't looking for dust. He was looking for complacency. He inspected every item of Jake's gear with a meticulous attention to detail. He checked the position of the ammunition pouches on Jake's vest, adjusting one by an inch. He tested the clasp on Jake's helmet. He checked the contents of Jake's first aid kit, quizzing him on the function of each item. "Where's your tourniquet, Barnes?" "Left pants pocket, Sergeant." "Show me." Jake showed him. Carver nodded. He moved to Jake's rifle. He picked it up, checked the chamber, tested the action. "Your life is not in your hands," Carver said, his voice a murmur. "It is in the hands of the man beside you, and his life is in yours. The only things you can control are your gear and your training. Do not disrespect your brothers by being careless." It was not a threat, it was a plea. It was the final blessing of their mentor, a last check to ensure his tools were sharp before sending them out to do their work. The final meal in the dining facility, DFAC, before the first patrol, was a surreal event. The place, normally a cauldron of noise and conversation, was strangely quiet. The men of Jake's platoon sat together at a long table, but the usual camaraderie was replaced by a somber introspection. They ate mechanically, their eyes fixed on their plates or on some distant point. The food, the same tasteless pasta and dry chicken they ate every day, felt different, each bite freighted with the solemnity of a Last Supper. Jake watched the veterans at the other tables. They ate and talked normally, laughing, oblivious to the tension emanating from the newbies' table. For them, a patrol was just another day at the office. For Jake and his men, it was the stepping off into the unknown. He looked down at his own food, a piece of bread, and thought of communion, of the symbolism of breaking bread. He looked at the faces of Diaz, Tex, and Evans. In a few hours, they would be in a Humvee, trusting their lives to each other. They were no longer just friends, they were an unsigned blood pact. He felt a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with the food. It was fear, but it was more than that. It was the weight of responsibility, the weight of his brother's trust. He finished his meal in silence and left his tray. It was time to prepare. The final hours in their container were a silent ritual, the final preparation. Each man was in his own world, focused on his own liturgy of survival. The sound was of metallic clicks as magazines were loaded, the rustle of uniforms being donned, the snap of buckles being tightened. Jake moved with a deliberate calm, each action a step in a dance he had rehearsed to perfection. He put on his body armor, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight on his shoulders. He checked his radio, his batteries, his night vision goggles. He stuffed extra first aid kits into his pockets. Last, he picked up his rifle. It was clean, lubricated, ready. He inserted a magazine, feeling the satisfying click, and pulled the charging handle, chambering around. The weapon was now hot, alive. He put it on safe. He was ready. He sat on his bunk for a moment and took his grandfather's compass from his pocket. He didn't open it. He just held it in his hand, the cool metal an anchor to reality. He thought of his father, his mother, of Clayton, and then he put them away in a secure compartment of his mind. The boy from Ohio couldn't go with him on this trip. Only the soldier could. Outside, he heard the sound of truck engines starting. The voice of a sergeant yelled, "Mount up, ladies!" Jacob Barnes stood, put on his helmet, and walked out the door into the desert night.